The night I left my husband Daniel's house, I thought I was simply walking away from a marriage that had quietly gone cold, but I never expected that silence
Yes,
would
I
be used
understand the
against me so
situation.
fast,
I'll make
so
sure everything
brutally,
is handled.
and so
Consider it done.
completely. By the time I realized something was wrong, my in-laws had already moved into my home, changing the way it looked, the way it felt, and even the way people spoke about it, as if I had never existed there at all. Margaret Blake told neighbors I chose to leave. Robert Blake handled the paperwork with a calm confidence I didn't understand, and Ashley Blake packed away my things like I was already erased. I remember standing outside once, watching the lights turn on in my own living room, and feeling like I was being locked out of my own life without a single conversation. Before I continue, if this story speaks to your heart, take a second to like and subscribe, only if it truly resonates with you, and I would love to know where you are watching from, your city or country, and what time it is where you are right now. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 32 years old, and this is the night everything in my family changed, even though none of them realized it yet. I never imagined a home could be taken so quietly, without force, without argument, just rewritten by people who believed silence meant surrender. But I wasn't gone the way they thought I was. And what they didn't know was that I had already prepared for something they could never see coming. Let me take you back to how it all began. Before the silence, before the locks changed, before my name started disappearing from the place I once called home. It started in a house in suburban Ohio, a place Daniel and I built together over years of saving, planning, and sacrificing small comforts to make something feel permanent, something safe, something ours. But somewhere along the way, that ours started shifting, slowly becoming theirs without me noticing at first. I used to think family meant protection, that in-laws were an extension of support, not control, but Margaret Blake had a different idea, one where decisions didn't need discussion, only agreement, and disagreement was treated like absence. The night I left, I didn't slam doors or raise my voice. I simply packed a single suitcase because I thought space would give clarity. I thought distance would bring understanding, but instead it became an opening they used immediately. Within hours, Robert was already helping manage things. Ashley was rearranging my belongings, and Daniel, caught between silence and pressure, said nothing that night that could stop it. I told myself I would handle it later, that I needed time to think, but time is something they used faster than I did. I didn't know that while I was staying in a small temporary apartment across town, trying to breathe through confusion, my home was already being redefined legally, socially, and emotionally by people who acted like I had given it away. And the most terrifying part wasn't that they moved in, it was that everyone around them believed they had every right to. But there was one detail they never checked, one paper, one record, buried beneath assumptions and confidence, and if I'm right about what I once signed without fully understanding its weight, then everything they built on top of my absence might not belong to them at all. And the truth about who actually owns that house is something none of them are prepared to face. When I look back, I realize none of this started the night I left Daniel's house. It started long before that, in the quiet way his family decided who I was allowed to be and who I was not. I used to believe I was joining a family when I married him, but what I actually joined was a hierarchy I never agreed to. One where Margaret Blake made decisions in silence and expected everyone else to adjust without question. At first it was small things that seemed too minor to argue about, like how she would rearrange the kitchen whenever she visited, moving my dishes without asking, or how Robert Blake would speak about family property, even when I was standing right there as if my presence was temporary. Ashley, Daniel's younger sister, was no different. She had this way of smiling while correcting me, like I was always slightly out of place in conversations. I was never invited to fully join. I remember one Thanksgiving clearly, not because anything dramatic happened, but because of how normal the exclusion felt. I spent the morning cooking in a house I helped maintain, only to be told later that the dining room seating had already been arranged and I should not worry about the details. So I sat near the edge of the table while conversations flowed over me like I was background noise. Daniel never meant to hurt me, I truly believe that, but silence has its own weight, and his silence became something I started to recognize as approval. Before Daniel, I grew up in a house where everything was measured, not just money, but attention, praise, even patience. My parents were not cruel in obvious ways, but they had a clear language of preference, one I learned to read early. My older brother was the stable one, my younger sister was the easy one, and I was the one who was told to figure things out on my own, which sounded like independence but often felt like being left out of support systems everyone else naturally received. I remember being 12 years old and sitting in a waiting room alone for over an hour because my school meeting schedule had been too complicated for anyone else to attend, while my sister's piano recital had a reserved front row of family members cheering before she even played a note. At 16, when I earned a scholarship interview, my father nodded once and said, "Good. That should help you become self-sufficient." While the same week my cousin was celebrated for making varsity soccer with a dinner reservation at a restaurant I had only ever seen from outside the window. These moments do not sound dramatic when isolated, but they accumulate in a way that teaches you where you stand without anyone needing to explain it. So when I married Daniel, I thought I understood quiet exclusion. I thought I had already learned how to exist on the edges of a family system, but I underestimated how much more structured it could become when people believed they had authority over shared spaces. The house itself was purchased early in our marriage, mostly from my savings and a portion of inheritance I had received after my grandmother passed away, something I never talked about openly because I never wanted money to define my place in the family, but it was there, documented, recorded, legally clear. That detail, however, became invisible over time as decisions slowly shifted toward Margaret's preferences, then Robert's assumptions, and eventually, Ashley's comfort. I did not notice when my name stopped being included in conversations about the property taxes, or when documents started arriving addressed primarily to Daniel, or when maintenance decisions were made without my input. It felt gradual, like erosion rather than impact. Then came the night I left, believing I was stepping away temporarily, believing distance would bring clarity, but what I did not realize was that my absence would be interpreted not as a pause, but as permission. And in that misunderstanding, something began shifting inside the structure of my life, something I could not yet see, but would soon realize had already started moving without me. The first sign that something was wrong did not come as a confrontation. It came as a message I was never meant to see. I was sitting in a small rental apartment across town, the kind with thin walls and a persistent hum from the heating system, when my phone lit up with a notification from an email thread I had been removed from weeks earlier. The subject line was simple, almost careless. Property update confirmation. My hands went still before I even opened it. Inside was a forwarded chain between Robert Blake and a local property management office, discussing temporary occupancy transition for the house Daniel and I had built together. There was no mention of my name, only Daniel Carter listed as primary contact, and Margaret Blake copied as authorized family representative. I remember reading that line 3 times, trying to understand how a house that had always required my signature for repairs, insurance, and tax filings could suddenly be discussed as if I had already been removed from it. The second message came 2 days later, this time a text from Ashley Blake sent to a family group chat I had been silently included in but never actively part of. She wrote, "We finally got everything organized. It feels good to have the house settled without confusion now that Emily is gone." Gone. Not moved, not away, not taking space, but gone, as if I had been erased through consensus rather than absence. I stared at that word for a long time, waiting for someone to correct it, waiting for Daniel to say something, anything, but the silence that followed felt more confirming than denial. That same evening, I received a voicemail from Margaret Blake, her voice calm in the way people sound when they believe they are already right. She said, "Emily, we assumed you would not be returning, so we have begun transferring household responsibilities accordingly." Daniel agreed it was best for stability. The word agreed hit harder than everything else combined, because I had not agreed to anything, not once. I replayed the message twice, then a third time, noticing how carefully she had structured it, how easily assumption had been shaped into fact. Later that night, Daniel finally called, but his voice carried something unfamiliar, not anger, not guilt, but distance. He said, "My mother thinks this is the best way to handle things while we figure out where we stand. We." A word that used to mean partnership now sounded like exclusion. I asked him directly if my name had been removed from the property records, and there was a pause, long enough for the silence to answer before he finally said, "It is just temporary, Emily, until things settle." Temporary, I repeated, because nothing about legal ownership should ever be temporary, but he did not respond. The next morning, I requested a copy of the latest property tax statement from the county records office, and what I saw made my chest tighten in a way I could not immediately explain. The listed owner was still both Daniel Carter and Emily Carter, unchanged, unaltered, exactly as it had always been. But the mailing address had been redirected to Margaret Blake's residence. Not ownership, but control of communication, and that detail mattered more than they realized. Because what they were building was not ownership, it was narrative control, and in their story, I was already missing. Within days, neighbors began referring to Margaret as the one managing the house now, and maintenance workers stopped calling me for approval on repairs I had always overseen. Even Daniel began using past tense when speaking about shared decisions, as if my presence had already been archived into memory instead of reality. And then came the final breaking point, the moment I received a formal notice from a legal office I had never contacted, stating that all household matters are currently being coordinated under authorized family supervision. There was no signature from me on that document, no authorization, no consent, only repetition of a version of events that had been constructed in my absence and accepted in my silence. I sat on the edge of the apartment floor holding that paper for a long time, realizing that what had started as distance had been transformed into replacement, and what they believed was my disappearance was actually being used as justification for something far more permanent, something I could no longer ignore, because at the bottom of the notice, there was a single line that confirmed everything was now moving forward without me. After the notice arrived, something inside me stopped expecting fairness from the situation and started expecting patterns instead. I told myself I would respond calmly, that I would clarify the misunderstanding, that this was all a chain of administrative confusion that could be fixed with a simple conversation. So I started where most people would, with phone calls. The first call was to Daniel. It went to voicemail after 3 rings, and when he finally called back an hour later, his voice sounded cautious, like he was stepping around something fragile. I asked him directly if he had authorized the changes being made regarding the house, and there was another pause, longer this time, before he said, "Emily, my mother is just trying to organize things so nothing gets complicated while you are away." Away. Not absent, not removed, just temporarily away, as if I had checked out of a situation I still legally and emotionally belonged to. I reminded him that my name was still on the deed, that nothing about ownership had changed, and I heard him exhale like the conversation itself was becoming inconvenient. He said, "You are making this harder than it needs to be." And then the line went quiet again. After that, I turned to email, writing carefully worded messages to Margaret Blake, asking for clarification, requesting documentation, offering to meet in person so we could resolve any misunderstandings. None of them were emotional. I kept them factual, structured, almost polite to a fault, because I believed at that point that if I stayed reasonable enough, the situation would correct itself. The first reply came 2 days later, short and dismissive. Margaret wrote, "We are acting in accordance with what Daniel has already agreed to. This arrangement is for the best stability of the household." She did not answer my questions. She did not address the ownership issue. She simply redirected everything back to Daniel as if he had become the sole authority over a shared life that I had helped build. I tried again, this time including Robert Blake in the message thread, attaching a copy of the property deed, highlighting my name in the document, as if evidence alone would be enough to restore logic to the conversation. There was no reply, not even an acknowledgement. Days passed, and silence began to feel like an active decision rather than absence. I then went in person to the house, standing on the driveway for nearly 10 minutes before knocking because I was no longer sure I would be welcomed into a space that still legally included me. When the door opened, it was Ashley Blake who answered, and her expression carried a rehearsed neutrality, like she had been practicing how to respond to my existence. I asked to speak with Margaret or Daniel, and she said they were not available, though I could hear movement inside the house. Faint but present, like life continuing without me. I tried again, explaining that I simply needed a copy of any document they had submitted regarding occupancy changes, and she responded, "Everything is already handled. There is no need for further discussion." Then she closed the door without waiting for my response. That moment stayed with me longer than I expected, not because of anger, but because of how complete the dismissal felt, as if conversation itself had been removed from my options. Over the next week, I attempted more formal routes, including a written request through certified mail, which I sent to both Daniel and Margaret, outlining my legal rights as co-owner and requesting immediate clarification of any changes made in my absence. The delivery confirmation showed that the letters were received, but there was still no reply. Even the silence began to feel structured, coordinated, intentional. I started noticing small things after that, like my access to certain utility accounts being restricted or service providers mentioning updated authorization contacts without my name included. Each change was subtle on its own, but together they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. I remember sitting in my temporary apartment late one evening, phone in hand, scrolling through unanswered messages, drafts of emails I never sent, and voicemail recordings that ended in my own voice asking questions no one was willing to answer. That was the moment I stopped trying to be included in a version of reality that no longer acknowledged me. I deleted the last draft email without sending it, placed my phone face down on the table, and for the first time since everything began, I did not reach for it again. Something in me shifted that night, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that I was no longer going to ask for permission to exist in a place that already knew my name but refused to use it correctly. And instead of sending another message, I opened a new folder on my laptop and began collecting every document, every email, every record I had ignored before, because I was starting to understand that the story they were building without me would eventually need to be answered with something they could not silence. The first weeks after I stopped responding to them felt like falling into a silence I had never experienced before, not the silence of being ignored, but the silence of no longer participating in a story that refused to acknowledge my voice. I began rebuilding my life in a way that had nothing to do with explaining myself to anyone who had already decided not to listen. I took on additional consulting work in property compliance, a field I had quietly been studying for years without telling anyone, because I always had a strange habit of understanding systems better when no one expected me to. My days started early, usually before sunrise, in a small office space I rented that overlooked a busy street in downtown Columbus, Ohio, where I organized documentation for clients who needed clarity in legal and structural ownership records. It was not glamorous work, but it was precise. And precision gave me something I had not felt in a long time: control. Slowly, I began to rebuild not just my income, but my identity outside of the Blake household system, outside of Daniel's assumptions, outside of Margaret's silent authority over spaces she had never legally owned. One afternoon, I received my first official client badge from a regional consulting firm I had been working with, a simple plastic identification card with my name printed in clean black letters. Emily Carter, Property Systems Consultant. I remember holding it for a long time, not because it was impressive, but because it was mine, issued through effort rather than permission. I kept it clipped to my laptop bag as a reminder that I no longer needed validation from rooms that erased me. My apartment changed slowly too, becoming less temporary and more intentional. I replaced borrowed furniture with pieces I chose myself, organized my space with a calm structure that reflected something I had been missing for years, and even started sleeping without checking my phone for messages that would never come. There were still moments when the absence of their voices felt strange, but over time, that absence stopped feeling like loss and started feeling like space. I filled that space with work, with learning, with rebuilding the parts of myself that had been minimized in environments where I was expected to remain adaptable rather than defined. One symbolic change came when I received a professional certification document in the mail, confirming my qualification in property documentation analysis, a field that required deep understanding of ownership structures, legal continuity, and historical record verification. I placed that certificate in a simple black frame and hung it above my desk. Not as decoration, but as proof of something I had earned quietly while my life was being redefined elsewhere without my consent. At work, I was no longer introduced as someone's wife or someone's temporary absence. I was introduced by my role, by my work, by what I could do rather than who I was expected to belong to. The more I built, the more distant the version of me from that house became, until it felt like I was remembering someone else's life rather than losing my own. And yet, even in this growing distance, there was one thing I never fully disconnected from: the records. I kept every document, every message, every notice that had passed through my hands during the shift that separated my name from my home. I did not revisit them often, but I kept them organized, because something in me understood that silence does not erase paper trails. It only delays their reading. The turning point came unexpectedly on a quiet evening when I was reviewing a routine compliance file for a client property and noticed a familiar pattern in the way ownership transitions were being misrepresented in secondary documentation. It was subtle, almost identical to what had been done in my own situation, and for the first time since everything began, I realized that what happened to me was not just personal confusion or family misunderstanding, but part of a structured assumption system that could collapse under the right verification. I remember leaning back in my chair, looking at the framed certificate above my desk, then at the stack of files beside me, and understanding something clearly for the first time. I had not been removed from my own life. I had been misfiled, and somewhere in that realization, the past stopped feeling like something I had escaped and started feeling like something that was still waiting to be corrected. Because even though I was sitting in a different city, living a different life, I was finally beginning to understand that what they thought they had finished with me was only the beginning of a truth they had not yet seen coming. In the weeks that followed everything I learned, the truth did not arrive with noise or confrontation. It arrived quietly, through official confirmations, corrected records, and a single legal review that clarified what should have never been questioned in the first place. The house had always been legally tied to both Daniel Carter and me, and any assumption of transfer or exclusion had been built entirely on interpretation, not authority. When the final clarification letter was delivered, it did not accuse anyone. It simply stated facts. Ownership had never changed. No authorization had ever been filed, removing my rights, and every action taken under the assumption of my absence had no legal foundation. I remember sitting across from Daniel in a small neutral office when he read it, his hands resting still on the table, his expression no longer defensive, just quiet in a way I had never seen before. Margaret Blake was there too, but she did not speak for a long time, only looking down at the document as if it had rewritten something she thought was permanent. Ashley avoided eye contact entirely, her earlier certainty replaced by something closer to discomfort than defiance. No one argued, because there was nothing left to argue against. The truth had already been written in a language that did not require interpretation. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain everything I had endured in detail, because at that point it no longer felt necessary to convince anyone of what had already been verified. Instead, I simply stated that moving forward, all communication regarding property or shared matters would go through formal legal channels only, and that my personal boundaries would be respected without exception. There was a long silence after that, the kind that does not ask for response, it only acknowledges distance. I stood up first, adjusted my coat, and left the room without looking back, not because I was angry, but because there was nothing left for me to retrieve from that space. Outside, the air felt different, not lighter exactly, but honest in a way that no longer carried hidden claims. In the days that followed, there were no more attempts to redefine my absence. No more messages trying to reinterpret my decisions. Only quiet acceptance that the version of the story they had created could not overwrite what was already documented. I returned to my work, to my routines, to the life I had built while learning how to exist without needing approval from people who misunderstood my silence. And for the first time, silence no longer felt like something used against me. It felt like something I owned. I often think now about how easily assumptions can become accepted truth when they are not questioned, and how important it is to understand the difference between being unseen and being unacknowledged. There is a quiet strength in realizing that not every story about you is yours to carry, and not every misunderstanding deserves your participation. If you are listening to this and you have ever felt erased, minimized, or spoken for in your own life, I want you to know that clarity does come, even if it arrives later than you expected, and even if it does not look the way you imagined. Sometimes healing is not about returning to the place where you were misunderstood, but about building a life where misunderstanding no longer defines your value. You are allowed to step back. You are allowed to choose peace over explanation. And you are allowed to believe that your life does not require permission from those who failed to see you clearly. My name is Emily Carter. I am 32 years old, and the lesson I carry from all of this is simple. Your truth does not become less real just because others choose not to see it. And maybe that is the part I wish I understood sooner, that silence is not the end of your story unless you let it be. If this story reached you in any way, I hope you carry that thought with you gently. Thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for listening with an open heart. And if you are walking through something similar, you are not alone in it. Sometimes the universe does not remove people to punish you, but to reveal what was already out of alignment. And when you finally see clearly, you do not need to shout. You only need to stand in what is true. If you found meaning in this story, feel free to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts, or simply leave a comment about where you are watching from. Because sometimes even small connections remind us that we are not as distant as we feel. And as this chapter closes, there are other stories waiting, stories of quiet strength, unexpected truth, and moments where life shifts in ways no one saw coming, and maybe the next one will speak to you just as deeply as this one did.